Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. I want to do today a quick chat about Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Finished this a couple of days ago. I've had this on my radar to read for literally years. It reminds me of that concept of 1111, the numerology concept. If you haven't heard of that, the time 1111. If you consistently see the time 1111, it's supposed to have a cosmic significance, like the synchronicity with the universe trying to tell you something. This is sort of how I felt about Mrs. Dalloway, where I've run across this book literally all the time, and once I became aware of it, it's sort of become a joke, like the universe really wants me to read Mrs. Dalloway. So this year I decided it was going to be my year to get Mrs. Dalloway read, and I have, and I really, it turned out to be different than I expected, but actually far more engaging than I expected. I'm actually still thinking about the characters in this very short novel, even now, a couple of days later. So that's pretty cool to me. But what the story's about, if you don't know, it was the novel itself was originally published in 1925, but the story itself takes place on a June day, one day in 1923, and Clarissa Dalloway is a 50-something-year-old society matron, and she's planning a party for that evening. And so we, meaning the reader, go with our narrator, who actually goes into the minds of the characters, and lets us know what they're thinking, and that's how the story is told. The point of view shifts from person to person, really abruptly, without warning. But I don't want to give the impression that was confusing. I actually followed the story quite well once I got used to this is how it was going to be. I would like to say, though, about Mrs. Dalloway, this is one of those works of literature that gets studied in universities, still. And so I am just a reader. I'm not familiar with literary history of where it fits in literary history, or where the literary criticism surrounding Mrs. Dalloway, but I'm just going to kind of briefly chat, I guess, about my experience, my particular experience in reading it. But from what I understand, it's a stream of consciousness type of novel, like I mentioned, where the narrator, we start out with Mrs. Dalloway as she's going to buy some flowers, and then we jump from person to person. Mrs. Dalloway, I would say, was, the main character. She kind of has an opposite, who's this war hero, or not war hero, but war veteran, whose name is Septimus, is in the park when Mrs. Dalloway goes to buy these flowers, as the novel opens, sitting with his Italian-born wife Lucrezia, who and Septimus actually has PTSD, we would call it today, from World War I. Remember, we're in 1923. And so we get his point of view, we get his wife Lucrezia's point of view, and several other main characters as the day goes on. So I don't want to give away too much about, it's not terribly a plot-driven novel, I wouldn't say, because this is basically just these people going about their day, but a lot does happen to some of the characters anyway as the day goes on. So yeah, I mentioned that Clarissa Dalloway, Mrs. Dalloway, and Septimus are kind of opposites. Mrs. Dalloway is she's in her 50s, so she seems to be pretty happy with her life. She's planning this party. Planning parties makes her feel happy, makes her sort of feel connected to the world. Septimus, on the other hand, has retreated from the world largely because he has been psychologically wounded from World War I, and his wife is actually trying to intervene and get him some help. So they're sort of opposites. Probably not explaining this too well. Whereas she's sort of engaging with the world, he's retreating from the world. She's in middle age, he's still a young man. So this sort of interplay between these two characters continues throughout the whole novel to the end, and I won't give away how it ends if you don't know. I didn't know, so I went into reading Mrs. Dalloway. Really, the only thing I knew about it was that there had been this movie, The Hours, made that was concerning it a few years ago with Meryl Streep and Nicole Kidman and forgetting the other person who was in it, but I had not seen the movie either, so I was kind of going into Mrs. Dalloway really completely not knowing a lot about it. So I won't give away how it ends because it did unfold for me as a new experience, but just some takeaways from it. One of the common themes in the novel to me was time. Mrs. Dalloway lives in Westminster neighborhood, I guess, of London, and Big Ben, the clock, she can hear, or they can be heard in her neighborhood, I guess. I gathered from the novel anyway. But clocks chiming away the time. I really got a sense of time moving, in the story because the clocks will chime the hour and the half hour, and the different characters at different places in the story will remark on that, and then through that we get the day wearing on, because this is only one day. So I thought that was really kind of cool and really kind of interesting. There was another kind of early on in the story. Actually, it's out when Mrs. Dalloway's out buying some flowers as the novel opens. Another interesting scene I thought was this car. This car is in the street, and it has curtains on it. So people in the street, they don't know who's in the car. And so it, how humans are, right? That causes a lot of curiosity about who this could possibly be. And is it the prime minister? Is it royalty? Is it the queen? And so there's a lot of speculation about that. And that scene really stuck with me because I've thought about that myself. Like, who's passing? You never know who's passing you by at any given time. And so, that scene just really kind of stuck out at me as being kind of cool and interesting, especially the flutter that it causes and speculation that who could be in this car in the middle of the day, in the morning, actually mid-morning, with the curtains drawn, therefore it must be someone important. So I thought that was kind of cool too. Another kind of recurring theme that I'm real interested to find out more about maybe is these colors of yellow and gray. I noticed the colors of yellow and gray recur throughout the novel, and I don't know what they mean. Like I said, I haven't read any literary criticism about Mrs. Dalloway. I'm assuming that since it's a recurring theme, though, it seemed to have a significance. One thing I wonder, there was a quote early on. Mrs. Dalloway is looking in a bookstore. She's thinking about getting a book for a sick friend, and she reads this quote, and the quote is, "Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages." And that I looked up because I thought, wow, I wonder what that's from. And it turns out it's from Cymbeline by William Shakespeare. And that quote actually sort of fits the story in lots of ways. And so I wondered, this yellow meant the sun and the gray meant the winter's rages. But ultimately I think it's about life, and this is ultimately what I took away from the book is about life. Mrs. Dalloway reflects on life a lot, as do some of the other main characters. And I think that, other main characters that I didn't really go into the other main characters. We have Septimus and his wife, Lucrezia, as I mentioned. We have his doctor, and then we have that doctor's wife, I think this Burroughs, and then we have Clarissa Dalloway, her daughter Elizabeth, her husband Richard. We have Peter Walsh, who is someone who has been in India. He's also in his 50s, but it's someone that was in love with Clarissa as a young person. And then we have some other characters too, whose heads we go in and out of. But one thing kind of cool though is that the different characters in the book, the main characters anyway, it seems like it takes place mostly in the present, like on this one day, as I mentioned, but they all go back in time. And how the different characters deal with the past seemed to me meant who was happy, who had aged, who was happy. So like Mrs. Dalloway and Peter Walsh, this man that's been in India, and her husband Richard, they all knew each other in the past, like 30 years previously, and they all reflect on this time in the past when they were all together at a house in another place when they were young, and Mrs. Dalloway was falling in love with Richard, and Peter was falling in love with Mrs. Dalloway, and ultimately Mrs. Dalloway married Richard, obviously. And Mrs. Dalloway seems to be able to let the past go. She might have some regrets. She talks about some regrets with that she had, decisions that she had made. One was kind of surprising. This character, Sally Seton, back in the 30 years previous, so this would have been like 1890s, Mrs. Dalloway apparently was in love with. So that kind of took me aback. I didn't really realize that that was going to be in this novel from 1925, which I thought was kind of interesting and cool. That this sort of subject would be touched on in a novel from that time. But then, on the other hand, we have that's Mrs. Dalloway. Then we have kind of her opposite, which is Septimus, this war veteran who has been psychologically wounded. He is sort of trapped by his past. And so he is, his past in the war is sort of has trapped him and caused him to, caused him a great deal of distress. And then Peter Walsh, the man who was in India and also in love with Mrs. Dalloway, he hasn't been able to let that go his whole life. His love for her when they were young. And there's actually several other instances of this that I won't go into. There is a real interesting character at the party later on. Mrs. Dalloway, is having this party who Mrs. Dalloway almost didn't invite, and this person wants to come to the party because she wants to observe, although no one ever talks to her. She's really kind of, she doesn't belong there, but she did belong in this group at one time, but she no longer belongs with them, and she can't really see that, So I thought that was kind of interesting, and that was just a real sort of interesting thread winding through this whole novel of this one day in the life of these people where they're reflecting on their past. Some of them regret parts of it, but yet they're happy in their present condition. Others are sort of trapped by the past, and then the time is ticking. The clocks are striking on the hour, on the half hour, as the party ultimately the story culminates in the party that evening. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm so glad I finally got Mrs. Dalloway read. It was a relatively short, I think a couple of 100 pages, if that. Read it pretty quickly. Probably would do with a good reread, though, in the future, because I'm really curious about the symbolism of the colors. That's kind of still got me thinking. So I'll leave it at that. Until next time, take care. Bye.